Today we are going to be starting period 4, which is 1450 to 1750, with the Renaissance, which begins at the tail end of period 3 and pushes into period 4. First, let's start with some review, since it's been a while since we've seen you. As you recall, in 1054, Christianity split into two major competing denominations: Roman Christianity, later called Roman Catholicism, and Greek Orthodoxy. So why did it happen? Well, you had the Pope for the Roman Catholic Church and councils and the patriarchs for the Greek Orthodox, and also that issue of the Nicene Creed. The result being that the Great Schism was a breach that the Pope desperately wanted to fix. While the Greek patriarchs and the Byzantine emperor were at first not responsive, they became more eager to reach out when in 1071 a Turkish army defeated the Greeks and occupied the majority of Asia Minor. The Byzantine Empire shrank substantially, and when a short time later the Turks also took over the Holy Land, the Byzantine emperor appealed to the Pope for help. The Pope responded by delivering a sermon in 1095 calling for a great Christian holy war against the infidels. He urged Christian knights to stop fighting against one another and to unite in fighting one common enemy. The result of this speech was the Crusades. There were many reasons for the Crusades to happen. Among one of them was the hope for religious reconciliation between the Roman Catholic and the Greek Orthodox Church. That doesn't happen. Another element was the European sense of religious righteousness. Their belief that Christianity was clearly the right religion. Muslims would come to believe that Islam was the right religion. Another element was, of course, territorial conquest, the expansion of European territories to encompass lands they considered holy. There were numerous crusades throughout the Middle Ages that encompassed the entirety of Christendom, and more besides that were localized. From a European perspective, the only successful crusade was the first one, in which crusading armies did manage to conquer the Holy Land and establish crusader kingdoms. More important than the events of the Crusades are the result of the Crusades. And in cultural terms, the end experiences of fighting tended to ingrain ideas of religious and ethnic prejudice. Christians continued to believe that Muslims were infidels. Muslims continued to believe the same about Europeans. Both Christians and Muslims were resentful of the Jews, who had often financed individual soldiers and armies for both sides, and Jewish populations were attacked repeatedly, especially in Europe. Although the interactions between these various groups were primarily violent, Europeans' experiences living in Muslim-controlled areas and conversely Muslim experience living with Europeans did facilitate the exchange of ideas. Europeans were exposed to centuries of Muslim learning, especially in the fields of science and mathematics, while Muslims were exposed to the European governing and military organization, manufactured goods, and artistic styles. Perhaps the most immediate effects of the Crusades were the creation of commercial ties, particularly between Muslim port cities in the Eastern Mediterranean and the Italian city-states. These ties allowed all involved to grow wealthy as they managed the major trade routes throughout Europe, Northern Africa, and Asia. While other European regions were overwhelmingly rural for the majority of the Middle Ages, Italy retained an urban lifestyle, especially in the northern part of the peninsula. These cities, like others around Europe, were self-ruling thanks to their charters. Like lands elsewhere in Europe, the land on which towns and cities were built did generally belong to a noble family. However, in exchange for a prearranged rent, whether in coined money or in kind as in bartering, these noble families granted town charters which allowed the towns to be self-governing. The strongest of these chartered towns often incorporated the surrounding countryside in their government, thus becoming city-states which controlled substantial territories. You can see a map on the screen of the various city-states in Italy. The most important are probably Florence, Venice, Genoa, Milan, right at this point, for all their various trading goods. We'll be focusing more on Florence today than any other. The power of town government of these city-states usually resided with their governing board, which sometimes named a leader or a chairman and sometimes simply ruled as an oligarchy. Artisan and professional guilds also played an important governing role. Guilds established wages and the quality and pricing of goods. They also played a civic role and were responsible for members' educations and for the upkeep of streets, city walls, bridges, and sometimes even churches near their neighborhoods. They formed the welfare system for their members, looking after the families of guild members who had died. You see on the screen the Guild of Bowyers and Fletchers. These would be the people that made bows and arrows. If you were not a member of the guild in that city, you would not operate as an artisan within that city. The important port cities of Venice, Pisa, and Genoa provided an important link between Europe's trading centers and the Black Sea and Eastern Mediterranean, where Muslim and Asian merchants sold their merchandise. These cities had used their merchant marine to take advantage of commercial opportunities that opened up during and after the Crusades. In addition, the spread of trading throughout Western Europe led to the increased need for coined money, which greatly facilitated trade. A merchant marine is something countries still have today, right? Merchant marine are people who trade and travel via ship. For instance, my brother is a merchant marine. He transports oil around the Gulf. So when we're talking about that, it means somebody that has shipbuilding capabilities, much like the ships you see on the screen. And we'll be talking more about naval technology in the upcoming weeks during this time period. As each kingdom, trade association, and Italian city created their own currency, a new business activity emerged to take care of conversions. Conversions is where you take one currency, say the US dollar, and try to see how much it would be worth in another currency, say the euro. Workers at the banchi, the Italian name of the counter or table where early Italian money changers set up shop, you can see it on the screen here, led to the modern word bank. Bankers worked to exchange coins from one region for the currency of another region. Most exchange rates were based on the Florentine florin, the most stable European currency. The emergence of bankers and merchants as important sources of currency for feudal lords and kings eventually led to the creation of the middle class, a class of commoners that was wealthier than serfs and peasants, but had less status and political power than the nobility. One way to differentiate between middle class. Peasants often worked the land, right? They were farmers. They may not actually own the land they worked on. The middle class maybe tended to own the land on which they lived, but they worked some sort of profession, like bankers. So while they owned land, much like the nobility did, they didn't, not work for a living, right? They don't have the power that the nobility had. It's also going to be with this emergence of banking that we see another growth of resentment towards one particular religion, in this case, Jews. Christians have a prohibition against usury, charging for loans. Jews do not. So in many urban places, Jews would become bankers. And as they had money, often that meant they had a certain amount of power, and, other people would be jealous. A couple of crises would hit during the 14th century that are really going to shake up Europe and allow for this change to happen that we are talking about today, the Renaissance. So let's talk about one of those crises. When the Mongols were sieging Kaffa, you can see that on the screen, one of the tactics they used was to throw the bodies of their dead soldiers over castle walls. See, these soldiers were dying from a mysterious disease. The goal was to dirty and perhaps ruin the water supplies within the city they were besieging. If you don't have clean water, you're not going to survive for long. As a tactic, it worked, but not because it always ruined the water, but rather because people inside the city walls got sick. In Caffa, a group of Genoese merchants, Genoa being one of those Italian city-states, were trapped in the city during the siege. They managed to escape and head for home. And unbeknownst to them, the disease went with them. The disease caused by the bacterium Pasteurella pestis, or as it's called now, Yersinia pestis, could actually take 3 different forms. The most common form of the disease was characterized by egg-sized swellings called buboes, which you can see on the images here. The buboes eventually gave its name to the plague, the bubonic plague, or the Black Death. As you look at the map, right, notice where the plague is spreading to and from. It's coming along trade routes, right, starting with Caffa, which you can see here, down through the Black Sea. And it would be spread in areas that had more people, right? So very few areas will be spared, mostly because they're isolated. And when you have a disease like bubonic plague and people don't have any sort of natural immunity to it, they are going to have some problems, right? And many people are going to die. And again, we're going to see the effects of diseases on populations throughout this period. Well, as you can imagine, as this disease is spreading through Europe, people are scared. They're terrified. They don't understand what's happening. And as this is a very religious time period, they're looking for a religious reason. They feel like God has turned on them, that God has punished them, and they begin to seek scapegoats. And one of the people they choose more often than not will be the Jews, people who have power, who aren't Christian, and who they believe brought this plague down upon them. You got to keep in mind that unlike modern day physicians, medieval people had no clue as to the cause or cure of the Black Death. As a result, all sorts of folk remedies and finger pointing was common. Some of the more common medical remedies included pomanders, oranges stuck with cloves, or a mixture of molasses and chopped snake. Sounds delicious, right? And like I said, many people believe that the plague was the result of God's displeasure with his people. And some came to believe that the Jews had poisoned the water wells with the disease. As a result, Jews in many areas, especially northern France and the Holy Roman Empire, were massacred. All sorts of other traditions come from this time period. The idea of putting posies in your pockets and protecting yourself with a circle, pocket full of posies, ashes, we all fall down. Different background to that childhood tune. The end result, the Black Death killed between 1/3 and half of Europe's population, roughly 25 million people. Some cities were forced to bury their dead in mass graves. In other areas, dead bodies were thrown into rivers and streams in a loss of hope. If they weren't going to survive, what was the point of preserving the water supply? People flocked away from urban areas where the plague seemed to hit particularly hard. As a result of so many deaths, the social structure and economic life of Europe were hit particularly hard. At first, the staggering death rate reduced the demand for European goods, so profits lagged behind supply. Later, as Europe recovered from the first hit of the plague, there were suddenly many fewer serfs and peasants to do the work. As a result, the value of laborers increased, and manorialism would be on its way out. as serfs began to realize the value of those who remained alive. Just like manorialism is being questioned, and of course God's punishment of Christians, as many saw it, was being questioned, so too does feudalism come into question during this 14th century crisis. The war that is going to ultimately test the feudal relationship would be between England and France. We call it the 100 Years' War. The reason this comes about, long time ago, not really so long, from the 1300s, but seemed like it to people in the time period. The English king had married an heiress of Avignon and gained a lot of land in France. So the English king, who was very powerful by the time we get here, the 1300s, was technically the vassal of a far less powerful king of France. But there's another problem. It's not just that one king is a vassal to another king. That's a problem in of itself. The King of England, by the 1330s, was also the grandson of the King of France. So, Edward, the King of England, was technically a vassal of his new French king, right? His cousin. He believes he should be king, right? He's more powerful. He's descended from the French king as well. Why should he not control both England and France? So when it comes time to swear his allegiance as a vassal to the new French king, he refuses, and the 100 Years' War begins. At first, the 100 Years' War was looking like an English victory. A big reason why the English were so successful had to do with the makeup of their army. By the 14th century, the English army was made up of mostly infantry, foot soldiers, like you can see up on the image over here, right? Foot soldiers. Along with archers and a smaller cavalry, knights. This makeup allowed the army to be very flexible and mobile when fighting, as the horses that knights used required lots of supplies, which meant that cavalry-heavy armies tended to move more slowly from battle to battle. The French, on the other hand, they still used the medieval makeup of mostly cavalry with a small group of archers and a small infantry. The effective use of good infantry raised the question of whether or not the knight was the best type of warrior, which in turn threatened the traditional medieval feudal relationship. Turns out, in the changing times, a knight, not really that effective. Now, I don't know if you know this, but fighting a war is incredibly expensive. In order to raise the money, the monarchs of both England and France levied taxes. In both England and France, the constant pressure to raise money fell primarily on the lowest classes, and these people ultimately would revolt against their government. Now, ultimately, the thing that is going to change the outcome of this long war is the introduction of some new piece of technology, or rather, new to Europe. It's the use of artillery. Artillery are weapons that you hurl through the air. But in this case, it's the use of artillery with gunpowder. The French would use gunpowder to power their bombards, or cannons, and they began to besiege English castles. As the tide of the war turned against the English, they too began using gunpowder. As a weapon, gunpowder was dangerous, because it tended to explode on you. But when used correctly, it was devastating. This new invention was yet another blow against the medieval knight, since armor couldn't really protect them against gunpowder weapons. Although the French would win the war, the experience of war really saw the end of long-standing medieval institutions. Feudalism, it seemed, was over. Despite France's victory, the English monarchs had no intention of swearing loyalty to the French monarchs. Of course, they didn't have to. They'd lost all their land and weren't vassals anymore anyway. Moreover, the military purpose of feudalism, having lots of knights tied to one lord, was no longer as necessary, seeing as the knight was discredited as an effective warrior. Both the English and French monarchs realized that the best way to have a solid fighting force was to maintain a professional standing army, armies that were paid for their service. As a consequence, monarchs were a bit less reliant on their network of loyal lords and knights, and they were more able to consolidate their own power. Additionally, their subjects began thinking in national terms. Instead of identifying themselves by region or town, as Londoners or Burgundians, they began to think of themselves as French or English, and a sense of national identity and a pride of one's nation. Nationalism is born. But these aren't the only changes happening in Europe. A new power is rising in the East, and this power will threaten the makeup of Europe for some time to come. By the middle of the 15th century, the Ottoman Turks had managed to consolidate their control over the Near East, and had also subdued much of the Balkans. In the early 1450s, the new Sultan of the Ottomans, Mehmet II, this guy, decided the time had come to defeat the last remaining vestige of the Byzantine Empire, the fortified city of Constantinople. And when we're talking fortified city, I want you to look at Constantinople. It has walls here and here, here. This city is impenetrable. No one had been able to defeat it. But Mehmet thought he knew how. The Byzantine Emperor, with an army of only 10,000, was depending on Constantinople's system of circular walls and fortifications, the things I just showed you, to keep the Ottomans at bay. Mehmet knew he had a challenge on his hands, so he brought 100,000 soldiers and a large fleet at his disposal. While his troops were able to surround the city easily, they were all over here. Capturing the city would require a partly amphibious approach. Mehmet's a smart man. He knew that in order to capture this city, a city that had been held by the Byzantines for almost a millennia, he had to take some chances. So he does a couple things. So first, Mehmet had to get his navy into the city. The problem is that Constantinople is protected by these iron chains, right? Like this. That chain right there, that's one single link. It doesn't seem like a lot, but that chain is about the length of my arm, right? So maybe a foot and a half, and it was in a series of chains that look like this. This area right here is called the Golden Horn. And as you can see, the two sides of the city are linked by these chains across the Golden Horn. A ship comes through, they pull tight the chain, they sink the ship. So it's one of the reasons why Constantinople has always survived. Aside from when you let Crusaders in who decide to attack you. So he had to get around this Golden Horn, right, that connects the Black and the Marmara Sea. So what is he going to do? Well, he actually builds some castles of his own. You can see him right up here. And he has his men clear the area of trees. And remember, he has 100,000 men. They take their ships, pull them out of the water, and they carry them over where the chains are, and they put them back in the water. That's right. Pause for a moment. This Ottoman Sultan, in order to get around chains, just brought enough men to physically move the ships out of the water and around the chain. And then that brilliant tactic of the Byzantines is completely negated. All right, so now that he's bypassed the chains and his ships are sailing into Constantinople, he has another problem. Those walls there, they're 10 feet thick. I'm about 5'5", so that's like 2 me's thick in length. How's he going to get through? Well, he has to bombard them with cannons. So, again, he's a good thinker. He comes up with other things. He has a 27-foot cannon built. This cannon is going to be disassembled and taken to Constantinople. It takes hundreds of oxen to carry. It takes 3 hours to load. It ultimately collapses in on itself because of the recoil. But it does its job. It breaches the city walls. So 6 weeks after beginning the siege, the Ottomans enter the city. After their successful conquest, the Ottoman sultans, who considered themselves successors of the Byzantines, called themselves Sultan-i Rum, or Sultan of Rome. They would rename the city Istanbul and begin transforming the city, burnt and devastated from the siege, into an imperial capital. And this isn't the end you're going to hear of the Ottomans. We'll be talking about them this 6 weeks, so more to come later on. So now that we've gotten to all the big changes leading up to the Renaissance, let's actually discuss the Renaissance. As an era, the Renaissance is marked by a shift in philosophy. This new philosophy will emerge in the early 1300s and gain steam after the 1350s. This new philosophy is called Humanism. And before we get to it, let's talk about the man who's recognized as the father of humanism. His name is Francisco Petrarch. You can see him on the screen. He's a churchman and a poet who is internationally known as a scholar and sometimes diplomat. As a scholar, Petrarch became interested in the classical authors, and especially in the way that these authors expressed themselves and their values. He was fascinated by the classical idea that human beings were, in a sense, perfectible, that they could strive to accomplish great things, especially great things in service to their communities. So Renaissance humanism was both an attempt to revive the cultural and literary legacies of the classical age, Renaissance meaning rebirth, and a new educational system which focused on studia humanitas, or the study of the humanities, grammar, rhetoric, poetry, moral and natural philosophy, and of course, history. Since humanists firmly believe in the potential of humankind, humanism is also associated with individualism, which at this time was centered around the idea that individuals could and should have independent thoughts and actions and attempt individual rather than collective pursuits. This is a pretty large break from the communal philosophy of Europe up to this point, which is one of the reasons why the Renaissance is such a change culturally. Northern Italy's growing wealth and commercial connections allowed the Italian urban centers to show evidence of their wealth in a variety of ways. The city-state which gave birth to the Renaissance in Italy, sometimes referred to as the Southern Renaissance, was Florence, or Firenze. Thanks to the support of the leading family, the Medici, the city of Florence became the heart of artistic and philosophical endeavors in the 1400s and into the 1500s. The Medici had started out as small-time bankers and become the bankers to the papacy. In fact, in the early 16th century, a Medici would become the Pope. Beyond this, though, the Medici patriarchs were also scholars and humanists. They were authors and poets, and most importantly, art patrons. Patronage is the system by which a wealthy individual supports a less wealthy artist, be they a painter, a sculptor, or a writer. Is the method by which the great Renaissance artists were able to display their talents. Only wealthy individuals had enough money to commission works of art, so artists were quick to attach themselves to someone who liked their work and was willing to commission it. Now, for the artists, let's say Michelangelo, they get the time to work and make commissions and do what they do best, right? Sculpt or maybe paint. But for the patron, what do they get? Well, in Florence, they get statues of the Medici family that showcase the support that they've given to art. They get put into paintings. They show their influence and their status and their wealth, being able to commission this art. So the artist gets to live and do what they love to do. And the patrons, well, they get to exhibit their growing status and wealth through this patronage. Now, in just a bit, you're going to watch another lecture on the artistic styles of the Renaissance. So we're going to leave visual art for now and move on to talking about, well, literary art. Besides visual art, literature was also a major part of the Renaissance world. Literary works received an enormous boost after the invention of the printing press. The invention of the printing press in the West, right? Because we know that the Chinese already had the printing press. So you can see it here on the screen. Now, the printing press would be taken advantage of by this man, Johannes Gutenberg. And thanks to both the printing press and the movable type, would make books more available, which in turn is going to boost literacy rates, although really only modestly. Perhaps 10 to 20% of Europe's population was fully literate. But you can see on the map, right, as the printing press spreads into various parts of Europe, we have this growth of intellectual pursuits. Now, Gutenberg is known for his Bible, right? The Gutenberg Bible is beautiful, artistic. You can see one at the Harry Ransom Center. But other authors are going to benefit from the increased literacy and the printing press. And we're going to see a rise in vernacular language. No longer are we only going to be printing in Latin. We're going to start having books printed in other languages: Italian, English, Spanish. All right, so let's talk about some of these authors. Boccaccio was a Florentine who, among other works, chose to create an anthology of common stories. To bring the collection together, he wrote his own fiction. 10 friends who leave the city of Florence during the height of the plague and must then amuse themselves. The stories and their content and their narrative reveal social and cultural values of the time. This book is called the Decameron. You're going to be reading excerpts of this soon. Another Florentine was Niccolo Machiavelli. He was born more than 100 years after Boccaccio's time. He was a political theorist, and his most famous work, The Prince, is considered by most a practical handbook about gaining and keeping political power. He is well remembered for two quotes: "The end justifies the means, and it is better to be feared than loved." In both cases, he was, of course, talking about gaining and maintaining political power. The Renaissance would, of course, spread north and would inspire both visual and literary artists as well. So among them, we have William Shakespeare, the great English Renaissance playwright and poet, man who helped standardize vernacular English. His works and his plays in particular showcase the individualism of the era. His tragedies in particular are greatly influenced by the Italian Renaissance. It's why so many of them are set in Italian cities, right? Fair Verona. Another writer is Miguel Cervantes, the great Spanish Renaissance author. He helped standardize Spanish. And his great work is Don Quixote. It's considered a satire of medieval society. As with the works of Boccaccio, both Shakespeare and Cervantes' works can be analyzed to understand the social, cultural, and even political values of the time. And that is what you're going to be doing coming up. You're going to be reading parts of the Decameron and parts of Don Quixote and examining these pieces of literature for their historical value. All right, that's it on the historical part of the Renaissance. It's time to learn more about the art.